The Honourable Dr Brian Walker.
Thank you, Acting President. I don't think there will be a single person in this chamber, or indeed in this Parliament, who would conceive of the concept of permitting disrespect for retail workers. That is, I think, without question. It's been pointed out earlier on in the second reading speech debate that we have actually made this a special requirement for retail workers, and I can see why. Because they have been singled out and they feel unprotected. Indeed, they are unprotected. Anyone can walk into a premise where goods are being sold and they can behave in the most despicable manner. That's absolutely clear. It is also true that we're seeing anecdotally more and more in the way of violence in this society. I think, in a similar vein, about my colleagues in the emergency departments, for whom it is not unusual to have vials, the bottles of urine thrown at them, to be smeared with feces, to be threatened with needles. Indeed, were a scalpel to be nailed by, to be threatened with a scalpel. I personally have experienced windows in an ED being broken and the broken glass being used to threaten me. I've been sworn at in the most vile manner. I won't repeat those words. Not just because they're unparliamentary, but they also would implicate the whole group of people who would feel comfortable at using such language. And there's a lot of them. I also think about the healthcare workers who are being bullied and assaulted, not just physically, but also verbally, mentally, emotionally, by those who employ them, the health bureaucrats who demand that they work twice as hard because they've cut the FTEs, the patients keep flowing in, and when you fail to actually do the work of two, you are then blamed and made to feel small. In fact, again, personal experience here, of an ex-soldier, male, who was promoted, as they usually are, into a place of incompetence, and was able to reduce to tears any nurse who dared to come to that person for help in managing the difficult burden of working in the healthcare industry on the ward with patients whose lives were at risk. So the response wasn't to help, but to actually bully them, reduce them to tears, make them afraid to come into work, to cow them, to reduce them in status to the level almost of a subhuman, a slave working on the ward to meet my demands. And such action remains entirely unaddressed. I'm thinking about my friends, paramedics, who will attend the most horrendous scenes. Those who are trying to pick up a dead baby and feel the wrath of a parent who might actually have killed that baby, attacking them with bricks, with knives, occasional weapons. You might expect it of the police who go into the most difficult situations and are assaulted on a regular basis. And then we have this scourge of domestic violence, which is absolutely wrecking the morale of a people who would accept the need to feel safe in your own home, safe with your family, but who somehow find themselves being attacked physically, verbally, in the most vile manner, trying to put food on the table for children and being beaten while that happens. And when we call for help, no help is forthcoming. But the coronial inquest might well give a few words of advice. Now, wash and repeat. Wash and repeat. Because it happens with terrifying frequency. We see the effect of retail workers. Let's take a bottle shop worker. I think universally, bottle shop workers have been assaulted and abused by the people coming through. Now, alcohol does that to people. I can't really understand why it happens in a children's toy shop, but it does, with distressing frequency. So it is excellent that a bill such as this is being brought in, but I ask myself at the same time, why do we need such a bill as this for a particular group of people? The words my colleague, the Honourable Kate Dow, spoke, I entirely agree with. We must treat people with respect. Everyone must be treated with respect. And that patently is not only not the case, but the cases where we're having disrespect and violence shown to ordinary members of society seems to be increasing. Now, my colleague, the Honourable Jorn Sidma, asked what was the data. We perceive it. Maybe it's just the media holding on to this and making it appear more frequently in our faces. The sense I get is that such things are increasing. Are they not? And here we have a classic example, yet another classic example, of closing the stable door after the horse is bolted. Someone has actually assaulted someone, and then we put in place legislation which may or may not be applied. I think, for example, as an example of legislation not being applied, the firearms legislation. The last few cases where firearms were improperly used by persons for whom, according to the current legislation, they should not have had firearms in the first place. They were either on bail or had been apprehended for their violent behaviour. And still, they were allowed to keep weapons, and still, with those weapons, they then committed crimes, which now we're seeing legislation being brought in to hamper the people who legitimately and legally own firearms and obey the law. But those who are treating weapons as a tool, who are illegally accessing weapons, illegally using weapons, these people appear to be immune from legislation. Shutting the door after the horse has bolted. So the question I put to the government is not that this bill should not be passed. It should. I support it entirely. The question is, let's look not at the superficial problems that we have, the violence in retail settings, the violence in the emergency department, the violence in the general street, people walking down the street and being beaten because someone took an unhappy look at them. We need to look at the underlying causes. I cannot imagine how anyone can think or feel the need to take a knife and enter a shopping centre. I'm sure I speak for all in this chamber, all in this parliament, not a single one of us would conceive of the idea of taking a weapon with us to go shopping. It's abhorrent. It's unnecessary. And yet, we find people doing that. Why? If we were able to find out why people feel the need to arm themselves and go out threatening other people, if we could find that cause, perhaps, rather than dealing with the symptoms after the horse has bolted, perhaps then we could get a reduction in the community violence. Would that not make sense? To attack the underlying causes from which arise all the other problems. Would you call me a fundamentalist? I call myself a fundamentalist. It seems perfectly reasonable and sensible to deal not with the outliers of the problems increasing, but to go down to the very source of the problems and deal with those. So I'm putting out a call here for the government. Yes, a good bill, but let us deal with the underlying problems. Let us deal with the fundamental problems afflicting our society, where violence is simply another way of expressing yourself. It's a form of communication, is it not? Rather than expressing your feelings with words of more than one syllable, expressing them clearly to an environment where people are supported and helped through. Perhaps we could use that instead of actually getting my knife or my gun or my brass knuckles or any iron bar or anything which would give me a bit of power over someone else with whom I disagree, whom I can then beat into senselessness or indeed to death, and express then my disgust for that person, or my hatred for that person, or my dissatisfaction with that person, or indeed just my general feeling of the world being in a bad place and I just want to strike out. Now, you might then say, that's very well a mental health issue. and I would agree entirely. If we were, and I bear in mind that I've been accused many times of making philosophical contributions, but I feel I need to do this because there is a philosophical aspect to this. Is there not? We need to look at what's actually causing this. And if the problem, as I propose to you, is one of poor communication, then perhaps we ought to be encouraging people to learn how to communicate one with the other and also with the self. Now, the worst example for that actually is Parliament, where people shout at each other across the chamber. That's entirely the wrong way of doing it. We need to work together to find solutions to the problems, not fight each other. Even the very names in here, the opposition, no, we should be working together to serve the people. It's a nice theory. So we see manifest in this place, albeit in civil terms, we see an extension of the problems in society where confrontation is norm. I look, for example, at the group of people who are also being continually assaulted and have no protections whatsoever. I am, of course, talking about the teachers. Those who are trying to teach our children how to actually live in this world, to understand what's going on and to live as human beings who can respect each other, these people, the backbone of the future, are being assaulted. 60% of headmasters have been physically assaulted by parents. The teachers who are being attacked by pupils wearing knives, with knives. The violent words being used online to bully other students. This has become the norm in our society. And we must recognise the underlying cause. And while it might take a generation to address, if we don't start addressing it now, in another generation they'll be saying, we'll take another generation to fix this, and so on and so on. We must do something now because the pressure is increasing in our society. And if we, as the ones with the responsibility for addressing the needs of society, if we fail to recognise the underlying causes, then we, colleagues, are, in part, to blame. And so, without casting any aspersions, I would simply raise this point. This is an important law, a sensible law. It doesn't go far enough, does it? It doesn't go far enough because it leaves swathes of our population unprotected after the horse has bolted. And I will put it to you that while it may be admirable in its intent, and I support it, it is but a shadow, a pale imitation of what needs to happen to keep our society safe, to keep our children safe, to keep our retail workers safe, to keep our healthcare workers, to keep our teachers safe, to keep all of us safe, when no one would feel the comfort of taking a knife with them into a shopping centre for whatever purpose ever. It's a big task. This bill will not address that. It will not. We know this. Each one of us knows this. It's a good start. But colleagues, we must take this further.